Hello, how's everyone doing today? I'm here with special guest Jeremy. Jeremy is getting his PhD in political science, I believe, right?
That's right.
At Claremont. And we are going to discuss, I guess, consequentialism versus whatever the hell I believe. How are you doing today?
Good, man. How are you?
Good. So I did say that I'm not a consequentialist, although I think I pretty much everyone is both a deontologist and a consequentialist. I mean, I think if you were to say to someone, I can guarantee that what I'm advocating will bring good results, but the means immoral. Few people would say, well, that's okay. I only care about the results. Likewise, I think if you were going to say to someone, I'm advocating a moral and ethical system, but it's going to produce horrible results, very few people would say, I don't care about the consequences. So I think you sort of need both. You know, it's like walking with just one leg. You sort of need both the consequentialism and the first principles behind it. But I guess when we started talking, because I think I said that it's never okay to violate people's property rights. And for instance, if someone has to steal if someone has to steal a car to drive someone to the hospital, even if they return it afterwards, that person should still be punished for doing so. And I think you disagreed, right?
I do. Um, but again, I think maybe there's two separate issues here, and one is so let's start with the first thing, which is you were talking about sort of you need a mix of deontology and utility, maybe. Um, and my response to that would be that so if you ever read Hayek, he sort of talks about the difference between particularistic utilitarianism and more generalistic, or some people call it utopian utilitarianism, which is that, like, so people talk about, they associate utilitarianism with Benthamite, or with Bentham, with Benthamite utilitarianism, which is that, you have a policy and you assess sort of the goodness of the policy based on the expected utility that it has, and that's sort of a particularistic approach. You assess each and every individual policy, and in that sense, I'm not a utilitarian because I agree that you can't know what the consequences are going to be, and therefore you can't sort of act based on the idea that you have knowledge of what those consequences are going to be, because there are always unintended consequences. And on top of that, people have rights. So even if you do know what the consequences are, you still might be violating people's rights, and I don't think that you can do that necessarily. But then you have sort of the more general or utopian utilitarian view, which is the one that Hayek took, and I think that a lot of deontologists take without necessarily recognizing it, and that is that you look at what's worked in society and history, right? So you have things like property rights, which have been not only good for prosperity, but good for individual liberty. They've protected individuals from the abuse of power and government regulation. So you can sort of look at history and say, okay, these property rights are good for society, and that's why they're good. They're not just good in themselves. They're not, a priori good. They're good because we've seen what they do. And even if you believe in I know that you said, you believe in sort of the absolute, you're sort of an absolutist when it comes to right, or at least with property. And that might be the case. I wouldn't say that I am. Depending on what you mean by absolute, but that might be the case. But you still have to. There has to be some kind of moral justification for believing in the absoluteness of property. It's not just. I mean, you have to, I mean, the questions, it sort of begs the question, why is property good? Why do you believe in the absoluteness of property rights? And my guess is that your answer is going to be something along the lines of, well, because they've been good for society or for individuals in the past.
I mean, that's partially true. Yeah.
Do you want to respond to that, or do you want me to move on to the second point you made?
I guess I'll respond to it briefly. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that I mean, I believe property rights are absolute based on moral principles. I mean, you know, who owns your body, and you know, I think I'm controlling it. No one else is making my lips move. If my hands move, it's me doing that. And you know, human beings are not ventriloquist dummies. And so, if you own yourself, I think the logical thing is that you own what you create as well. Obviously, you don't own human beings, and you don't own ideas. But excluding those two things, create, and you own it in perpetuity. And that's sort of the ethic. And yes, you know, there are good results from this. You know, being secure in your person, knowing that you know you could spend hours investing stuff, and no one, and if someone tries to steal it from you, that there are repercussions. There obviously are many benefits from respecting private property. But even if there weren't, I would still advocate private property just because I believe it's ethical and moral.
But so, I mean, it still begs the question, why is it moral? Why is it moral that I own my property in perpetuity? I mean, it seems to me sort of explanation without argument. I agree with you that I own my property in perpetuity, and that it's moral. But why is it moral? What's moral about it?
Well, who else should own it, right?
Well, who should own anything?
Fine, but someone has to. So the question is, who should? And
well, who has to? Why? Why does anyone have to own anything? I mean, we've lived in, well, not us, but you know, a world has existed without recognition of property.
Yeah, and not for very long. Those people died out. Right?
Okay, so that gets to my point.
Because you have what? The tragedy of the commons. You have under or overproduction. You have people not conserving resources. It's first come, first serve if you don't have an allocation of property rights.
I agree, and you're sort of making my point, which is that society can't function well without the establishment of property rights. It's bad for individuals and bad for society when we don't have property. And that's where I think the moral efficacy comes from. That's where we derive the moral principle from. It's that we've seen what happens when we don't have property, and it's not good. And that's why it's moral. It's not just moral because I can't just say I own my I own, my work because I created it. I mean, that might be true, but it doesn't explain why it's moral. Does that make sense?
Sure.
I own my property. It's moral because property rights are moral because it preserves society and it preserves individual liberty in the long run. I mean, that's the case I would make. And I think that is...
I don't think persuasion is necessary, right? So, I mean, look, if to use an extreme example, I go to a woman and I say, I want to have sex with you. And she says, no, it's my body. Should I say to her, well, explain to me why it's your body? No, I think the response is, it doesn't matter if I can convince you or not. I own it, and if I fail to convince you, tough shit.
Okay. So what? So what exactly is your point? That you don't need any explanation for the rights that you have? Are we talking?
I think it's probably a good idea to be able to defend them when they're challenged, but I don't think it's a requirement.
So I think, well, I think so. I have to sort of distinguish between. I mean, in that case, you're making sort of a. I mean, yeah, obviously, I think if you walk up to a woman on the street, she shouldn't have to come up with a legal defense or necessarily a moral defense for why she has the right to her own body. But if we want to establish why it's moral that she does, if we actually want to know why that is, then I think we do need an explanation for that. I'm not saying she needs to come up with a good argument when she runs into someone on the street, but I don't think you can explain why her argument is moral without some kind of moral justification. Well, why does she have the right to her body? I mean, it's not just that she does. I mean, that can't be an answer, right? There has to be something supporting it. There has to be a deeper principle.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, there is.
I think there's a utilitarian. I would argue a utilitarian principle, and I don't mean that in the sort of Benthamites. I don't mean it in the sense that, well, I would never say like, well, if we had to, like if we had to let society, if we had to let a guy like rape 5 women in order to benefit 100 others or something like that, I would never say that's okay. That's a different kind of utilitarian argument, which I don't agree with. But I think if you have a rule, a general rule or a principle like the one you were just talking about, it needs to have a general utility of sorts. Like it needs to, its explanation has to rely on some sort of benefit to society and individuals. And I stress and individuals. But because I could come up with any kind of I can rationalize some right I might have in any way I want. Like I might, I could say, I mean, I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there's a reason I can't just make up rights. I could.
No, rights be dependent on anyone else, right?
What?
Rights are not a gift. So if someone says, I have a right to education, can you get education without someone else giving it to you?
No, I understand.
On a deserted island, you are totally free, in the sense that no one else is using violence against you, and your rights are not determined based on a grant from someone else.
Right.
But if someone says, I have a right to education, that means the only way you can have your right fulfilled is determined based on other people giving it to you. And then that's not a right.
I agree. There are no positive obligations, and I agree with that. But to even make that argument, to even make the argument there are no positive obligations and that there are no positive rights, rests on a moral principle, a moral principle that is beneficial to society, which is that you don't have the right to infringe on the negative rights of others, because you can't. There are no positive obligations without infringing on the negative rights of others, which is why you can't have positive rights. It's because they conflict. Negative liberty doesn't conflict.
Well, negative liberty can conflict in terms of needs. If I want your shirt and you don't want me to have it, your right conflicts with my desire to have your shirt.
Well, negative rights don't conflict with each other, is what I'm saying. You don't have a right to my shirt. You might have a need for it. You don't have a right to it. But that doesn't mean that. And so I think this goes into the second point you were making when we started, which is that just because you don't have a right to my shirt and I have a right to my shirt doesn't mean that it's necessarily immoral for you to take it from me. I think it probably depends on what the circumstances are.
But Len, your property is not secure, because Len, all that's needed is some sophist who is very good at trying to persuade people that it's probably better for me to have your shirt than you, right? I mean, if property rights are just dependent on who can make the better arguments, then your property is not really secure at all.
No, because, again, I think you have to distinguish between the right and what's moral. And I think just because I have a right to something doesn't make it immoral in every single circumstance for someone to take it from me. I'm not saying that we need to make it legal for this person to have my shirt. I'm not saying that my right isn't absolute. My right to my shirt might be absolute, or let's take the car thing for example. It's probably a better example. If someone steals my car, Humer talks about this in his book, but if someone steals my car to rush someone to the hospital, then yeah, that person's breaking the law and they are infringing on my right. But does that mean they're acting immorally? I would argue no. I think you might disagree with that, but I would argue no. But I don't think there's a conflict between the person's moral action and my right, if that makes sense. I think that rights and morality
are not always. That Humer would say, which he does say in the book, and he also says not in the book, if you just talk to him, which is there should be no penalty for taking the guy's car in an emergency, unique situation, such as driving someone to the hospital. But that presupposes that the person who is driving someone to the hospital, one, is using the property in, I don't know, a better way than the person who owns the car. But one who says that's the case, I mean, it may be possible that the person whose car you're stealing is going to go and save, 20 people's lives, or who knows, and now he doesn't have his car, and now those people die. So you have no idea that even in an emergency situation that you're actually maximizing overall utility. And secondly, I mean, I think that just opens the door for it. I mean, people could say, oh, look at these rich people, and they're just wasting their money on expensive art. If I had part of their money, I'd really, invest it and use it to make soup kitchens and help people. And maybe that's true. Maybe if we rob from very rich people, we might use the money in more socially beneficial ways. My response is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how I use the money. It doesn't matter how much good it produces. They have a right to their property, even if they waste it according to my value system.
I agree with that, but I think you keep making the jump from individual moral actions to overall policy. I'm not advocating that we make policy based on what individual actions are moral or immoral. I'm not saying that we should make it a law that says it is legal to steal someone's car if they feel it is morally beneficial or maximizes utility. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there is a difference between believing in rule consequentialism, which is sort of the sort of Benthamite utility argument. What are the consequences of this policy going to be? Like, I'm not arguing that. I think there's a difference between that and actually being in a situation where you have to make a decision where you're aware of the particular conditions, you have better information and knowledge about what's going to happen to this person, and yeah, you're right, you don't know what that other person was going to do with that car. The person whose car you're stealing, maybe they were going to take it and go rescue 100 children, drowning in a river. But I think if we're being realistic, the answer is the odds are that if you're stealing someone's car to take someone to the hospital who's dying, 99 times out of 100, the thing that person is doing is going to be more beneficial than whatever the person whose car you're stealing would or would not have done with that car. And that does, again, this doesn't justify, I'm not justifying any kind of utilitarian policy. I'm just saying in particular circumstances, moral actions, there's sort of a difference, but you talked about this with Walter Block in your interview, which I watched. And he talked about the difference between thin and thick libertarianism. And I think that if you want to talk about thick libertarianism, then in a situation where you could have done something to save someone's life but choose not to, I think that is immoral. Even if it's not illegal, I think it's immoral.
Okay.
I think you have to separate the morality of actions from whatever rights we may or may not have as libertarians.
Look, you possess free will. I mean, I tried stressing this point when I was sort of interviewed, not really because he wouldn't shut up and let me talk, by Jen Helfeld, where Jen was saying, if you're starving and you're lost in the woods, you steal. I sort of said, well, that's irrelevant. What I may do and
what was the question?
And what the law should be are two separate. Huh?
I'm sorry, but you're
I'm
breaking.
I'm lost in the wood. Oh, sorry. I'm lost in the wood. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
A little better. Yeah, a little better. How's your connection?
Okay, I'm lost in the woods. Fine. I'm lost in the woods. You can hear me?
Yep.
We're good? Okay. I'm lost in the woods, and I see a cabin, and should I steal food, or would I steal food? And my response is, I may. I may very well steal the food to live. My argument would be, you have to weigh these things. Do you steal the food and accept the punishment, or do you not steal the food? I'm not saying you shouldn't drive the guy to the hospital to save his life. That's a choice you make. I'm saying that if you do that, there are repercussions, and I think it's fine if the guy decides to punish you for it. But if you truly believe it's justified, you take the punishment. So yeah, if I was in the woods, I would steal food to live, and I'd take the punishment because I know that the punishment would be less severe than me starving to death. So yes, I might violate property rights in an emergency situation, but that doesn't mean, even in the emergency situation, there should be no penalty. It only means there should be a penalty, and I should be willing to take it.
I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument. The reason I wouldn't agree with it, but I mean I see the purpose behind it, because you're saying there's still a violation of rights, which if there's a violation of rights, it deserves punishment. Because if we are to preserve these rights, then we need to punish transgressors, and I see the purpose of that. My problem with that is when you have these extreme situations where, and again, we're only talking about the most extreme situations here. But I think when you have these situations where it's hard to know because it's so hypothetical, and it's like how many times has this really happened? But let's take the stealing the car example again. I think that so I mean we agree that it might be moral to steal the car, but the person should still be punished. Well, you think the person should still be punished, but we agree that it might be moral, even if the person should be punished. But but I don't know that the person should be punished only because you are deterring. I think it deters people from making the moral action in the future. If you have, not everyone might be, some might see a person dying and think, oh, well, I could steal this car and save this person, but I don't want to receive punishment for this. Like, I'm doing a good deed. Why the hell do I want to go to jail for stealing this person's car just to save this life? It's not worth it to me. And so I think in a way it actually encourages immoral action to punish people for doing something that is moral but not necessarily legal. And I would be more comfortable with it, with having the general rule being that it's illegal, but for trusting people to make the moral decision on their own if the circumstances require. And the thing is, if the person doesn't have a good justification, they're stealing the car for some other reason, then they should go to jail. I mean, that to me seems reasonable. But putting someone in jail because they're doing something good doesn't make sense. Now, if they take the car and take someone to the hospital and they crash it somewhere along the way and destroy the car, then maybe, yeah, then there should be, repercussions. That person should have to pay the damaged property. But if he just takes the car, takes the person to the hospital, brings the car back in one piece, I mean, other than paying for the gasoline that he used, I don't think there should be any punishment.
Well, look, in a free society, this is up to the property owner. So there wouldn't be, the state says we're going to punish you. The person whose car you stole gets to decide. And unless the guy's a complete dick, if it was truly legitimate, he would probably say, oh, I understand, thanks for leaving a note and letting me know, and I understand, it was an emergency, I'm not going to press charges. And if he is a dick, remember, he has to go in front of a jury. And the jury may very well say, you're an asshole, you think it was justified. So the jury may very well agree with you and not me, and I believe freedom is the right to be a dick. So, I believe, it's okay to be a dick. I support the right to be a dick. But maybe the jury will say, it was justified. We don't find the defendant.
Right. I actually don't. I think that's very reasonable. I mean, unfortunately, we don't, live in a sort of polycentric system where we probably would have more rational outcomes if we were to sort of delegate out these, these kinds of judgments to local communities of property owners. And I agree. And if that were the case, then I would have no problem with that. Obviously, we don't live in that kind of society, but
unfortunately, yeah.
But I don't disagree with the sort of the premise of it. I think that, yeah, maybe it should be up to the property owner, but and also, but sort of to be decided by a jury of his peers and the peers of the person who committed the act, and I think they would come up with a reasonable solution. Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Okay. I won! All right. Yeah, so, look, maybe you won't even have a jury. I mean, that's typically up to people themselves. People may say, I don't want a jury, and then it's up to the judge to decide. But, yeah, I mean, and I certainly don't think people would go to jail. I mean, as we spoke about earlier, I think the jail first of all, look, I don't know who would pay for a person to go to jail, right? For-profit business owners, if they had a jail, all of their 50% of their clients or so, I mean, they'd go out of business. And who would pay for their upkeep? So I think that jails are not really profitable. I mean, right now, the taxpayers pay for them, but I think in a free society, punishments would be torts anyway.
I disagree. I'll say this. I do think that jails are misused and they are overpopulated, and they, like I said to you the other day, I mean, I think the more they try to do, the less effective they are. They're like government in that way. And I think that, yeah, nonviolent criminals probably shouldn't go to jail. And, minor offenders shouldn't go to jail. But I think that very violent criminals, such as murderers, rapists, and people who commit violent assault, maybe they don't kill anyone or rape anyone, but, maybe they hold up, a clerk at gunpoint and steal from him. So the threat of violence. I think people like that should go to jail, not because I think it necessarily deters those people from committing crimes, but at least it keeps them off the fucking street. And I think that people would pay. I disagree with you. I think people would pay for that, even if we were living in a sort of polycentric system where, taxpayers were sort of directly, where they were paying for this, where they were actually, paying for jail. And I especially think they'd pay for it because to let these criminals run free is ridiculous. I mean, people don't want to live in a society where there are murderers and rapists running around. And B, they're probably more likely to see the benefits of a system that would keep these people off the streets and would probably be more effective than the prison system we have now, because it would only be jailing people for committing, actually dangerous crimes.
The prison system we have now is obviously fucked up, and I think is a good example of what happens when you violate property rights. So there's an excellent book I recommend time that people read called The Enterprise of Law by Bruce Benson. If you haven't read it, it's really worth getting. And one of the things that he talks about is the current system has a tragedy of the commons problem. So right now, police in a free society would be measured based on willingness to pay. But now it's whoever calls the police first, the police come and get. So if a person says, hey, my car's missing, that person will go first if the person calls first, more than, maybe help, I'm being raped, help, someone's, beating me up. And also because there's a tragedy of a commons problem, more people are using the juries, the courts, and because of this, judges just take the cases that they think are most easy to solve just to get them moving instead of the cases that have priority.
Right. I agree. I think that's a problem with our system, though, and not with jail in general.
Right. I would agree.
But yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's obviously a big problem. I'm not really sure that anything is going to be done about it anytime soon. I mean, I'm not sure I see that changing.
Yeah.
I'm pretty pessimistic. I think you probably are too.
Well, I'm pessimistic about everything.
Yeah. I mean, we're Jews, fucking pessimists. But I think that at the same time, there is a purpose for jail. There definitely. I mean, I wouldn't want to live in a society, and I, like every other libertarian, hate paying fucking taxes, and I think that. But jail wouldn't necessarily have to rely on tax. I mean, if you had a polycentric system like we were talking about, I mean, I guess you could call it a tax, but if you lived in a community that sort of made these decisions together, they could pay.
Yeah, I guess it's possible. Maybe I'm just saying that because I don't like prisons and I'm trying to justify it. I mean that could be the case.
I mean, you would need. I mean, in any system, you would have individuals coming together and coordinating to create a safe community. I mean, it just makes sense. Right. Would they? I mean, it doesn't mean they need a government to do it, but they're going to want to have some kind of system of coordination where they're keeping, whether it's like a neighborhood watch, for example, like something that happens in our society. And if there were no government to punish, then they would want some system that reassured them that they were safe. I think the system would probably do fewer things because they don't want to pay so much money that they feel like their money is being wasted on prosecuting people with who have a dime bag in their pocket or something like that. The punishment might just be taking the dime bag. But, for people who are actually violent, then I find it really hard to believe that the punishment's just going to be, oh, you're going to pay a lot of money. Now go out and, do whatever you will. You know, it just doesn't seem likely to me, and I don't care I don't like if you're living in an anarchic, system. I still think you would have people coming together to stop that kind of thing.
All right, you're probably right. It's interesting. One of the comments in this video is, "Do children have a positive right to be cared for?"
People are actually watching us talk about this nonsense?
Huh?
People are actually watching us talk about this nonsense?
Oh, yeah. So do you want to answer that question? I sort of answered it in my last video. I believe that it's not a positive right to care for your children because you created them, and you're simply fulfilling your end of the obligation. It's simply doing, it is a right that you simply have just by being born, irrespective of your actions, and you created children, so you have an obligation to fulfill that duty. And if you choose not to, then you have an obligation to see that someone else takes your children off your hands. What's your view?
I've always struggled with this, and I have trouble thinking about it or conceptualizing it sort of within this rights scheme. I think it's almost kind of irrelevant. I don't want to say irrelevant, but I think that the sort of rights scheme is not necessarily a useful way of thinking about it. And that's not to say that they don't have rights, but I think the bigger issue. I mean, so the question what the person asked was, do we have a positive obligation to our children to feed them? Or to take care of them? Is that the question?
Yeah, that is the question.
I mean, I think it's impossible to say no.
I agree.
I think, does that mean they have a right, though, to our help? That to me almost doesn't seem relevant. Obviously if you have a child, you obviously have an obligation to that child to take care of it. I mean, you make this sort of rational argument that, because you made the decision to bring the child into this world, you make an obligation. I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument. I don't know that I need that kind of argument to justify it, because I think anyone who's trying to justify that they don't have obligation to their kids, it can't be reasonably argued with anyway, if that makes sense. Why am I wasting my time trying to rationally justify positive obligation when clearly some fucking asshole, just doesn't want to take care of his kids? So I don't know. I guess that's kind of my answer, is who cares? Right. I don't think it should, Claire, I don't think it's a stupid question. It's just not the way I think about it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So, have we solved this dilemma?
Yeah, you're wrong and I'm right.
What? No, it was the other way around.
I don't even know what the dilemma is anymore. I don't know. Is there a dilemma that we are solving? Is there some kind of...
There's always a dilemma. We're human beings. For God's sakes. I mean...
I guess my overall point would be, just to take it back to the beginning, would just be that I don't think that people often talk about deontological approaches and utilitarian approaches as if they're binary. And I think there are different kinds of utilitarian approaches. I'm not a utilitarian in the sort of Bentham sense, but I am a utilitarian in the Hayekian sense, where I do believe that the benefits and progress of human society rely on these rights that we have, and that's why they're worth protecting. They're not, we can't know what these rights are a priori, but we can look at history and see, how they've been beneficial to societal growth and the development of sort of human reason and dignity. And so they do have a general benefit in that sense. So yeah, I guess in a sort of Hayekian tradition, I wouldn't say, I don't know that I would say I'm a Rothbardian, but I think even if you look at Rothbard, I know you're a huge fan. I think even if you look at Rothbard, he relies on the historical benefits of property to make the case for his moral arguments. He uses them to make sort of these absolutist arguments about property, but he justifies the absolutism based on the general utility that they've had throughout history.
Well, actually, I think it's in For New Liberty. Maybe it's the Ethics of Liberty, but I think it's in For New Liberty, where there's a line where Rothbard says, even if the system that I am advocating would bring misery and havoc to the vast majority of people, I would still advocate it because it's moral. Unfortunately, that's not the case.
I think
You can't get more unconsequentialist than that.
Yeah, but I think that's bullshit. I mean, give me a break. He's taking the Randian approach. It's the Ayn Rand thing where he needs to find a way, because first of all, I haven't read that, and I feel like that must be one of his later works, because in his earlier work that doesn't sound like what he says in some of his earlier work.
I think it came out in the 70s or so. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
But I think, yeah, he probably at some point adopted the sort of Ayn Rand dogmatism, because he realized that unless you rooted these rights in this sort of absolutism, regardless of its human benefits, because reason is moral in itself and choice is moral in itself, then we can never justify the existence of these rights, because someone is always going to point to the empirical benefits of these. Someone is always going to say, look at what they do empirically, and if empirically they don't work, then we should get rid of them. And so they found this need, Rand and Rothbard found this need to take this sort of dogmatic approach, which I personally have always felt was almost, I don't want to say ironic, but to me always felt tongue-in-cheek. I have a very difficult time believing that Rand and Rothbard would support these rights if they brought human misery to 99% of people. And if that's really the case, then
I think they're being a bit hyperbolic to make a point.
Exactly. I agree. And I think the reason they do that is because everyone else, Rothbard in particular, I think, was probably reacting to Hayek, who became more conservative as he got older. He less libertarian, more conservative. I think he was always libertarian, but he made a lot of concessions in his later work, especially in Constitution of Liberty. If you actually read Rothbard's criticism of Constitution of Liberty, he calls it an evil book. And
I have not read that book. We both have it for free over the summer. We got it for free.
Constitution of Liberty?
Yeah.
Yeah, now I have 2 copies of it instead of 1. But Rothbard, it's actually in his unpublished works. You can find it online, but he calls the book evil and says it undermines libertarian principles. And I sort of suspect that Rothbard was reacting to that sentiment. Not necessarily just Hayek, but that sort of general libertarian sentiment where a lot of the justifications for these rights were based on historical arguments about their benefits. And so maybe they were just trying to take a different approach for the more thick-headed people who sort of rely on these sort of immediate empirical justifications for property.
I mean, one of the things that I've always sort of said is, the reason you can't say that consequentialism is necessary if to determine if an is because the consequences happen after the action. You're putting the cart before the horse. The consequences happen after you act. So how can we say it's what happens after you act that determines how you should act if that happens beforehand?
Because how do we determine morality? If we're talking about action, individual actions, how do you determine morality at all? How do you determine what's moral?
Just based on a universal ethic. Everyone has the same rights, and it has to be universal. It has to be. It can't be subjective. It can't be based on culture. It can't be based on the argument from authority, which people often like to say. I often think it's interesting, but one of the things that a lot of religious people say that I've heard is, well, without God there'd be no objective ethics. Well, what does that mean? If the only way something is objective is because someone says so, then you don't have objective ethics. You just have the whims of whatever that person says. But I mean, I think my main point is that how can you even know our?
I'm sorry, are you still there?
Yeah. How do you know what the consequences are after you already act?
So this is, I mean, I kind of see. So you're sort of taking the Kantian, almost like the Kantian categorical imperative out framework. Is that what I'm sort of getting?
Well, I do believe that that's a good. I mean, I do believe in the categorical imperative, which is, you should have it where any moral system that you advocate, you would want other people to follow that moral system, right? So if someone's going to say, I believe it's good if I act this way, but you don't act that way, you're not advocating morality, right?
Right. I'm not a Kantian. I would be if I thought a universal ethic were possible. But again, I look at sort of because I just don't think morals. In order to determine that, we need to be able to determine morals a priori. And I don't think that's the way morals are developed in reality. I think morals are developed over time through the inter-individual process or inter-individual actions among human beings over time. And that's not to say that just because killing at one time may have been moral, it was okay at the time.
No, killing was never moral. People just decided not to follow their morality.
That's what I'm saying. But let me finish. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it was moral at one time. That I agree with you, but I think it took time to acquire the knowledge to realize the immorality of it. And I think to assume that we can determine morality a priori without experience, without the development and progress of individuals within society, I think is to assume more than we know. I mean, we can't actually know what's moral without experience. If we had lived 1,000 years ago, there are a lot of things we would have thought were immoral that aren't. Like homosexual marriage, for example. I mean, you probably would not have been able to find many people who thought that was immoral, and maybe you don't think it's moral. I assume that you probably do. But
I wish every guy in the world was gay but me. That way I could have any woman I wanted.
I don't know. I think you might still have trouble then. But I think that the point is that we learn these things through time. There is innate knowledge that we're not even aware of that we acquire over time. And this is the sort of Humean argument. This is I basically take the opposite. I disagree with Kant completely on morals. Not that I don't think the idea of universal ethic is nice, but I look to Hume, particularly his essay concerning human understanding and some of his other work on morals, where Morals and Epistemology, I should say, where he basically argues that you have to be, people call it radical skepticism. I think it's unfair to call it that, but the idea is that we can't know anything about morals. We can intuit. We have intuition. We have what Humer, I guess, would call ethical intuition.
Well, then how does anyone know, right?
We don't. We don't know.
We do. We know that murder, rape, theft, and fraud is immoral.
You and I know it now. We know
well,
it now.
I didn't know it when I was 1 year old.
I don't mean that we know it now as opposed to we didn't know it when we were one. I mean, we know it now as individuals, whereas 2,000 years ago, there would have been immoral things that happened and we wouldn't have been able to recognize that they were immoral.
Well, look, if someone's going to say, for instance, I don't think that murder is immoral. If someone truly believes that, he should not object to being murdered. Because how can he, coherently? How can a person say, I see nothing wrong with murder, but if you were about to murder me, I'm going to say, hey, don't do that. That means you do think murder's wrong.
I agree with you. I just don't agree with the rationalistic justification for why murder is wrong. I think there's no explanation for it other than we've learned.
Why is murder wrong? It's just a gut reaction.
Not gut reaction, but it is learned over time. Yes. I mean, I think it's hard for us to believe that because it's so viscerally wrong. We understand it that it to us it appears like what is explicit knowledge in the way that we have explicit knowledge about the natural sciences, right? But it's not. These things are social behavior is learned over generations. There would have been a lot more instances where killing was okay. Maybe not call it murder, but maybe someone committed treason and killing was perfectly moral. A person betrayed their country. Let's fucking kill them, and that would have been completely moral. And it would have been conceived as moral. I shouldn't say it was moral, but it would have been conceived as moral. But it would have been no different. It would have been no different. We would have been making the same argument. We know it's moral. We just know it because we just do. And I think that's bullshit. I think that we can know something to the extent that we can know anything, but that doesn't mean that we actually know it.
Fine, but who cares? I mean, no. Like, why does that matter?
It matters because you can't have a universal Kantian ethic because we don't have it's an ahistorical understanding of how morals and ethics are developed. In a thousand years from now, human beings are going to have a completely different understanding of what's moral.
But that doesn't mean there's not. See, I think you're confused. Like one of the things that I've heard people say to try to prove how there's no such thing as an objective morality, how morality is just subjective, is they'll say, well, what's considered moral in one area in another society is considered immoral.
No, that's relativism, and I don't make that argument.
But it sounds like that's the argument you're making, that 100 years ago it wasn't considered immoral, and now it is, therefore morals are relative.
No, I'm not, and my argument always gets, everyone always accuses me of this, and I do not make that argument.
Maybe there's a reason for that, Jeremy.
Maybe what?
So what is your argument?
My argument is that you and I can know that something is immoral, but sorry, let me back up. You talked about objective morality, and this is kind of this concept actually illustrates well my problem with the way people think about morals. When people say something's objective, when we talk about something objective in the scientific sense, we talk about something that is independent, that acts, we talk about its nature independently of how humans think about it, right? So atoms react in so in science, we want to figure out how things work. We're not interested in how we think about the way things work. We're interested in how they actually work. In social science, it's totally different. The data in which we're interested is the way human beings perceive things, because that's what's important. That is morality. What is morality is the way that phenomena is perceived by us. And so in that sort of like specific sense, there's no such thing as objective morality, because morality is totally subjective in the sense that it can't exist independent of the way we think about it. It's not subjective in the sense that, well, killing here is wrong, but in other countries it might be okay because there's a culture of killing. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we don't know that the reason that we know killing is wrong is because we've learned it over time and we can intuit it. But there's no like explicit knowledge that exists before us intuiting it and experiencing it and using our reason to figure out that it's wrong. There's nothing there's no explicit knowledge that can tell us that. And so I can say to you, murder is objectively wrong, but I don't really have much to go on other than, well, it just is. There's nothing objective about it. Does that make sense?
I mean, I guess. I mean, yeah. But maybe it's not worth saying now, but one of the things that I was going to say, when I guess I falsely accused you of being a relativist, is I think the flaw in that position is the fact that there's disagreement doesn't mean both sides are right. So, someone might say, well, I believe that a woman has a right to get an abortion, and someone else says, I believe that a woman doesn't have a right. They can't both be right because they're in conflict. Now, I'm not saying my view on this issue now because it's irrelevant. All I'm saying is one of those two answers has to be the right view. They can't both be right, right? Either God exists or God doesn't exist. The fact that there's disagreement doesn't mean they're both right, and it doesn't mean that there's not a right answer. It just means that someone's wrong here.
I agree. And I don't think that's inconsistent with what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that we'll only know whether it's right or wrong over time. Either we'll know or later generations will know based on whatever sort of transpires or develops. But there's nothing a priori that can tell us whether or not it's right or wrong. We don't have any sort of explicit knowledge that can tell us, yes, this is right, or yes, this is wrong. We just have to figure it out based on intuition. That's really all it's only right or wrong in the sense that it's right or wrong in the way that we all think about it. There's nothing more than that. Like I don't know how else to sort of articulate this point without beating a dead horse, but
well, I've never really understood that expression. I think it's more humane to beat a dead horse because it's already dead.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that it's inhumane.
I think if you're going to beat a horse, it's better to beat the dead.
It's a little sick to beat a dead horse, actually.
Well, you don't want to beat a live horse. That's just cool.
I actually have to go.
Fine, I think we did beat a dead horse. Anyway, that was fun. Letting me win.
Whatever lets you sleep at night.
All right. Anyway, it was a good discussion.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it.
All right, I'll send you the link, man.
What'd you say?
I'll send you the link if you want it.
Please do.
All right. Take care.
All right. Talk to you soon.